Welcome to the Tribunal of Terror. Imagine waking up in the middle of the night to the sound of fists pounding on your door. The chill of damp stone creeps through the floorboards. Outside, muffled Latin chants echo in the darkness, mixing with the clank of armored boots and the bleating of confused livestock. You stumble to the door, heart pounding like a war drum. As it creaks open, you're blinded by torchlight and confronted by robed figures. Faces half-shadowed, holding parchment bearing a red seal and a list of sins you never committed. You don't even get to pack a cloak. In minutes, you're barefoot in the mud, accused by someone whose name you'll never know, for reasons no one will explain. Welcome to the Holy Inquisition, where whispers become verdicts and redemption is measured in blood, fire, and how long you can scream. Contrary to what most horror stories suggest, the Holy Inquisition didn't start with fire and brimstone. It began, like so many disasters, in a cold, candlelit chamber filled with powerful, paranoid men. Around the 12th century, the Catholic Church found itself under siege. Not from swords or armies, but from ideas. People were starting to read the Bible, on their own, in languages other than Latin. Some were forming breakaway sects, holding secret sermons in barns and caves, daring to suggest that maybe, just maybe, the Pope wasn't infallible. This was the era of the Cathars in southern France, the Waldensians in Italy, and other proto-Protestant movements that dared to decentralize spiritual power. These weren't just religious rebels. They were ideological landmines threatening the Church's monopoly on truth. The Church didn't just fear heresy. It feared a world where the common man could access divinity without clerical middlemen or tithes. To the Church, this was spiritual terrorism. And if God wasn't going to smite these heretics himself, well, someone had to help. Enter the Inquisition, a holy bureaucracy dedicated to the purification of souls and the annihilation of dissent. Imagine a divine HR department merged with medieval CIA, ruthlessly efficient, terrifyingly vague, and absolutely immune to accountability. Its job wasn't merely to punish blasphemers. It was to terrorize the population into submission through fear, spectacle, and surgical paranoia. They didn't arrive with armies. They arrived with documents. Letters patent from the Pope, writs of authority, and the smug confidence of men who believed their torture chambers were acts of divine mercy. The sight of an inquisitorial banner alone was enough to make entire villages fall silent. Merchants closed their stalls. Children were pulled indoors. Conversations dried up mid-sentence. Because once the Inquisition arrived, nobody knew who would be next. Once in town, they'd set up shop, usually in a commandeered monastery or noble estate, and declare a 30-day period of grace. During this time, you were encouraged to come forward and confess your heresies voluntarily. Of course, few people actually knew what counted as heresy. Saying a prayer in the wrong order? Heresy. Owning a banned book? Heresy. Not attending Mass 3 Sundays in a row? Heresy. Thinking too hard? Almost definitely heresy. Even the way you cross yourself could be interpreted as suspicious. Those who confessed during the grace period might be let off with public humiliation, fines, or a small taste of flogging, just enough to remind you who's boss. But those who denied the charges or tried to stay silent, they got extra attention. And by attention, we mean solitary confinement, psychological breakdown, and eventually torture. This is where the machinery of fear kicked into full gear. Interrogations weren't just about finding the truth. They were about manufacturing it. Inquisitors believed that the body could reveal what the soul tried to hide. That pain was a kind of divine spotlight. That your screams were notes in a hymn of holy purification. But let's not skip ahead. Before you ever got to the torture chamber, you'd endure the waiting. Days, sometimes weeks in isolation. Your cell would be dark, damp, and crawling with vermin. You'd be denied contact, sleep, food, or hope. Your name would be scratched into the walls alongside hundreds of others, some followed by prayers, others by curses. Every footstep outside your door became a potential end. Each creak, each echo, another roll of the celestial dice. And here's the twist. You never knew who accused you. That was by design. Anonymous denunciations were encouraged, even rewarded. Your jealous neighbor, your envious cousin, the priest you accidentally slighted 5 years ago, Any one of them could write your name on a scrap of parchment and drop it into the holy mailbox of doom. The system practically begged for abuse. It thrived on vendettas, rumors, and the everyday pettiness of medieval life. This anonymity weaponized paranoia. It turned entire villages into surveillance states. People stopped speaking. They stopped thinking. And when everyone's potential informant, silence becomes survival. Even priests accused other priests. No one was safe. Truth became irrelevant. What mattered was obedience and fear, an illusion that the church was purifying the world, one burnt body at a time. Every confession, coerced or real, was a trophy. Every punishment was a sermon in steel. Was it ever really about saving souls? Or was it about creating a world where questioning authority felt as dangerous as wielding a sword, where dissent equaled death and faith was measured in blind obedience? Centuries later, the Inquisition is officially over. The robes are in museums. The racks are rusted. But the mindset? Oh, it's alive and thriving. In forums, in comment sections, in hashtag crusades, and ideological witch hunts. We've traded torches for tweets and tribunals for timelines, but the ritual is eerily familiar. Public shaming, anonymous accusations, moral absolutism. It's all there. The robes just look different now. So light your candles, heretics. The real fire is just getting started. Subscribe to the channel. Leave a like. Share this video and drop a comment, or risk being labeled a heretic by the algorithm and sentenced to eternal irrelevance. Confess, or we'll help you remember. Imagine being strapped to a bench in a windowless chamber that smells of mildew, dried blood, sweat-soaked straw, and the faint incense of sanctified guilt. The air is thick, humid, claustrophobic. Rats skitter across the stones. A single candle flickers overhead, casting trembling shadows that make the iron tools on the wall seem like they're breathing. Above you stand a man in robes, part priest, part executioner, asking calmly if you're ready to confess. To what? It hardly matters. The questions are irrelevant. The answer is pain. Welcome to the interrogation chambers of the Inquisition, where salvation had a soundtrack. The click of gears, the snap of bone, the hymn-like wails of the condemned. Torture wasn't just a method, it was a philosophy. Pain was the path to purity, and every scream was a victory hymn sung directly to heaven. In a time when logic was heresy and mercy was measured in bruises, the Inquisition crafted suffering into a fine art. Let's talk instruments. The strappado was a classic, almost elegant in its cruelty. Your hands were tied behind your back, a rope looped through a ceiling pulley. You were hoisted high, then suddenly dropped, stopping just before the ground. The force rent your arms upward, dislocating shoulders, tearing tendons, fracturing bones. You wouldn't confess yet, but you begin considerate. The rack followed, a bed of wood and chains, deceptively simple, ankles at one end, wrists at the other. With every crank, your body stretched like a human marionette. Cartilage tore, joints popped. Sometimes you heard your own ribs crack before you felt it. The inquisitors, ever devout, recited prayers as your body tried to separate from itself. Occasionally, a scribe stood in the corner, dutifully noting every inch gained and every sob uttered, because even agony had to be documented properly. Need something more intimate? Entered the pair of anguish, a metal fruit that blossomed inside you, inserted into your mouth if you were a blasphemer, your rectum if you were a sodomite, or your vagina if you were a witch. Then turned, slowly, mechanically, unfolding like the petals of hell. Blood mixed with iron, tissue tore, and all of it happened in a room where sacred hymns echoed from stone walls. Other fan favorites included thumb screws to crush every doubt right out of your fingers. The heretic's fork, a double-pronged iron placed between your chin and chest or chin and throat, to keep your head upright and your lies at bay. Water torture, where you be made to swallow gallons, sometimes until your stomach burst, under the holy assumption that water, like truth, could be forced in. The rack and pulley combo, a dynamic duo used when simple stretching wasn't theatrical enough. And yes, the infamous Iron Maiden, a spiked coffin designed to embrace you with the love of 1,000 nails. While many historians debate its actual use during the Inquisition, the idea of it was as potent as its blades. Terror thrives on myth as much as metal. Stories about it alone were enough to silence dissent. Torture wasn't just accepted by the church, it was canonized. In 1252, Pope Innocent IV issued the papal bull ad excepanda, granting official permission for torture to extract confessions as long as the soul was in danger by death. Convenient. So long as you didn't technically kill the accused during torture, you could tear them apart in God's name. Pain became theology. Suffering became scripture. But make no mistake, this wasn't improvisational sadism. It was ritualized, bureaucratized, sanctified brutality. There were rules, documents to fill, logs to keep, witnesses to verify that the right amount of pain was applied. Not too much, just enough to make Jesus proud. Interrogations were often publicized as moral theater. Some towns built special chambers just for inquisitions, decorated with holy relics and verses carved into walls, reminders that this was all part of God's plan. The inquisitors often believed they were performing a sacred duty. Their journals are filled with pious self-reflection, regret over a particularly bloody session, joy at a confession extracted just before a tendon snapped. These men were theologians of torment, soul surgeons armed with iron and fire. They prayed before torturing. Sometimes they wept during it, but they kept going. And let's not forget the victims who confessed just to end it, not because they were guilty, but because the silence of death seemed like mercy compared to another day in the holy dungeon. If you think human endurance has limits, the Inquisition made it policy to find out exactly where those limits were, and then keep going. Still think you'd hold out? Picture this. You're shackled, soaked in your own sweat and urine, your limbs twisted, your jaw trembling. They bring in your child, or your spouse, and place them gently on the rack instead. You don't just hear their bones break. You feel it, because in the Inquisition, they didn't just torture individuals. They broke families. They shattered generations. These weren't just punishments. They were messages. Every scream was a sermon. Every confession, coerced or not, was proof that the church was winning its war on heresy. And centuries later, while we may no longer use a rack, we just digitalized the strappado. Online mobs demand confessions. Public figures beg forgiveness under pressure. Pain isn't physical anymore. It's reputational. But the mechanics are chillingly similar. Public spectacle, demand for penance, ritualized humiliation, and all of it recorded, shared, archived for eternity. So next time someone asks you to speak your truth, make sure they're not holding the pair of anguish behind their back. Confess your loyalty to the channel. Smash that like button, ring the bell, drop a comment, and share with your fellow modern heretics. Otherwise, the algorithm might decide you're due for a little inquisitorial attention, the pair, the rack, and other divine gifts. To the Inquisition, suffering was a sacrament. In a world where saints fasted to hallucination and martyrs bled for glory, it made perfect sense, at least the cloaked men tightening your restraints. That agony was the fastest route to truth. And nothing says God loves you like being impaled by a carefully engineered instrument of divine persuasion. This chapter is a tribute to the art of pain. Not just any pain, but the theologically justified, church-funded, socially accepted pain that became the ultimate flex of spiritual authority. These weren't just tools of punishment. They were sacred artifacts, holy gadgets, the MacBook Pros of medieval sadism. Each device came with purpose, ritual, and a perverse sense of honor, designed to extract not just confessions, but complete submission of body, mind, and soul. Let's begin with the star of the show, the pair of anguish. This elegantly horrific device resembled a metallic flower bud, usually made of bronze or iron and open with a screw mechanism, inserted into a victim's orifice. Mouth for liars and blasphemers, anus for homosexuals, vagina for women accused of witchcraft. It was then expanded gradually, rupturing tissue and shattering dignity. It didn't kill. That wasn't the point. It was pain, purified and personal. Tailored torment. The pair was small enough to be concealed in a robe, yet devastating enough to silence a soul. It left no visible scars, only the kind that echo forever in the dark. Next up, the rack. Think of it as medieval Pilates, designed not for flexibility, but for irreversible anatomical deconstruction. With wrists and ankles secured, the crank was turned slowly, lengthening the body past its natural limits. The sounds, stretching sinew, popping joints, the occasional muffled scream, became a symphony of repentance. Victims often left the rack unable to walk, speak, or sometimes even remember their own names. And if bones shattered too early, the process was paused. Not out of mercy, out of calculation. The iron spider, a favor for women, heated in fire, then applied directly to the breasts. Designed not to kill, but to deform. Because what better way to teach morality than through mutilation? The scars weren't just physical. They were public, displayed in marketplaces, branded as living sermons. Then there's the breast ripper, sometimes poetically called the teat-tearer, for clawed arms designed to clamp down and rip off the breasts of accused witches and adulteresses. The metal was often heated. The process could last minutes. The trauma? Lifelong. The Judas cradle deserves a special mention. The accused was hoisted above a pyramid-shaped seat, naked legs bound, and lowered until the point penetrated them. Slowly, painfully, over hours or days. The point was rarely sharp. Its dull edge increased suffering. Death wasn't the goal. Infection, degradation, and submission were. Still not horrified? Let's try the Spanish tickler, a handheld rake made of iron, used to shred flesh from bone. Popular with inquisitors who wanted to make a point. Literally, limbs were peeled, backs flayed, and the victims, often tied to public posts, became living warnings. And then there were the more imaginative variants, devices soaked in religious symbolism. The heretic's fork, with twin prongs, one under the chin, one on the sternum, designed to keep you from nodding off. If your head dipped, the prongs would pierce flesh. Sleepless was saved, they'd whisper. The iron chair, embedded with hundreds of spikes, heated to searing temperatures. Victims were strapped in and left for hours, a slow roast for the Lord. Sometimes inquisitors watched with wine in hand, commenting on the strength of the soul as it sizzled. The Catherine wheel, also known as the breaking wheel, where limbs were smashed and braided through spokes until your body resembled abstract art. Execution optional. Dignity? Never. But this wasn't just about metal. It was about performance. Devices were displayed before use, paraded through towns like holy relics. Children whispered their names. Adults crossed themselves at the mention. Blacksmiths were commissioned not just as craftsmen, but as co-authors of sacred terror. Some devices bore inscriptions. Malleus Maleficarum, Fiat Voluntas Dei. Let thy will be done, with gears, levers, and fire. Some inquisitors curated collections. Tools were blessed. Some had names. The Pair of Toulouse, the Rack of St. Dominic. Stories spread accursed devices that whisper at night or bled on full moons. Superstition layered itself over cruelty, making each scream seem fated. And the victims? They were not always rebels. Sometimes they were healers, or midwives, or philosophers, or girls who danced too freely, or widows with land. Anyone who made someone nervous. Anyone who made someone jealous. Anyone who dared to live differently. Why this creative explosion of torment? Because fear is efficient. Pain speaks every language. A broken body was the loudest confession of all, and a tortured soul left a ripple that echoed through generations. This was power, raw, visible, and unchallengeable. Imagine living in a world where your silence was suspicious, your questions were dangerous, and your screams were proof of your guilt. Now stop imagining, because in many ways we never left. The tools are different. The rooms are digital. But the rituals? Still alive. Subscribe, like, comment, and share. Because even in the age of Wi-Fi, ignorance isn't bliss. It's just an updated version of the Judas Cradle. Confess now, before the next rack is algorithmic. Joan, Galileo, and the Heretics Hall of Fame. Heresy came in many forms. Curiosity, courage, creativity, or simply being born on the wrong day to the wrong people. In the twisted logic of the Inquisition, to think differently was to endanger everyone. To ask questions was to risk your soul. To teach, heal, or imagine outside church doctrine was to light the firewood beneath your own feet. Welcome to the Heretics Hall of Fame, the sacred blacklist of those who dared to exist beyond the boundaries of sanctioned thought. These weren't merely historical figures. They were intellectual martyrs, pioneers of forbidden ideas. Some changed the world. Others were simply erased. But all face the tribunal's cold gaze, its appetite for obedience cloaked in righteousness. Let's begin with Joan of Arc, the 19-year-old peasant girl who heard voices and dared to act on them, guided by visions of saints. She dressed in male armor, led armies into battle, and turned the tide of the 100 Years' War. But heaven forbid a teenage girl claim divine inspiration without a bishop's permission. Captured by the English and sold to ecclesiastical authorities, Joan was put on trial in 1431. The charges? Cross-dressing, witchcraft, speaking to angels, acting like a man. The court was a circus of male clergy intent on proving that God didn't talk to poor girls from the countryside. She was interrogated 13 times. She held her ground. She tricked theologians with sharper answers than they'd expected. But it was never a real trial. It was a ritual execution of defiance. She was burned alive in Rouen marketplace, her ashes scattered in the Seine to prevent relic collection. 2 decades later, the church realized they'd incinerated a saint. Too late. Then there's Galileo Galilei, mathematician, astronomer, and stubborn truth-teller. Armed with a telescope and a mind hungry for answers, Galileo confirmed Copernicus's heliocentric model, that Earth revolved around the sun, not the other way around. A revelation? Yes. A theological crisis? Absolutely. In 1633, he was dragged before the Roman Inquisition. Under the shadow of the rack and threats of torture, he recanted, he whispered, and yet it moves, and was placed on a house arrest for the remainder of his life. His books were banned, his ideas declared dangerous. Centuries later, the Vatican finally admitted he was right. But in his time, truth had to be silenced for safety. Giordano Bruno didn't get a second chance. Philosopher, poet, magician of the mind, Bruno believed in an infinite universe teeming with life, a God too vast for church walls. He preached cosmic unity and spiritual freedom. For that, he was imprisoned for 7 years. Tortured, dragged to a public square in 1600, naked and gagged. He was burned alive by men who claimed to love God. His last recorded words, "Perhaps you pronounce this sentence against me with greater fear than I receive it." William Tyndale, the English scholar who thought ordinary people should read the Bible in their own language, was betrayed, strangled, and burned in 1536. His crime? Translation. His legacy? The foundation of nearly every English Bible today. So much for divine gratitude. Women, too, filled this hall of the damned, not just for visions or theology, but for existing independently. Marguerite Porete, a French mystic, wrote of divine love so profound it transcended church authority. Her book, The Mirror of Simple Souls, was banned. She refused to recant. In 1310, she was burned in Paris before a crowd of silent clergy. Her ashes mingled with the wind that carried her words further than the flames ever could. Hypatia of Alexandria, though pre-Inquisition, serves as a spiritual ancestor. A Neoplatonist philosopher, mathematician, and astronomer, she was torn apart by a Christian mob in 415 CE. Why? She was too intelligent, too respected, too independent. History often repeats itself, just with more official paperwork. Lesser-known victims included wise women midwives and herbalists, many condemned under vague charges of witchcraft or sorcery. Sometimes being literate was enough. Sometimes being alone. One woman in Spain was accused of heresy for reciting prayers in the wrong order. Another, in Italy, for interpreting a dream. The standards were invisible. The punishment, very visible. And let's not forget those who weren't burned or executed but erased. Silenced. Discredited. Condemned to obscurity. The Inquisition didn't always need fire. It could use forgetfulness. The church understood that memory is a battlefield, and they fought to control it. These trials weren't about justice. They were about theater. Elaborate performances of power, dressed in holy robes and conducted with grim pageantry. Confessions were staged, sentences choreographed. Death became dogma. And yet, here we are, Centuries later, still quoting Galileo, still honoring Joan, still reading Tyndall's words, still finding Bruno's universe more expansive than ever, the church tried to silence them. But truth, inconveniently for inquisitors, doesn't burn so easily. Imagine you live in a time where your conscience makes you dangerous, where asking questions is enough to summon a trial. Now ask yourself, is that time really over? Because today's heretics don't carry torches. They carry books, blogs, podcasts, whistleblower reports, tweets. They don't get burned, but they do get banned, boycotted, deplatformed. The tools have changed. The spirit of suppression has not. Subscribe, like, comment, and share, because remembering the heretics is how we avoid becoming inquisitors. And let's face it, you'd rather be burned by a sick metaphor than an actual bonfire. Spies, lies, and holy paranoia. If the Inquisition had a catchphrase, it wasn't "in God we trust." It was "in suspicion we thrive." Welcome to the medieval surveillance state. No cameras, no microphones, just fear weaponized into a community sport. The Inquisition didn't need omniscience. It just needed everyone to suspect everyone else. The church didn't simply monitor behavior. It rewired social life into a system of holy espionage, where silence was suspicious, friendliness was dangerous, and trust was extinct. You didn't need to see the Inquisition to feel it. It was in the hush that fell when a priest entered a room, in the way neighbors averted their gaze, in the sudden silences during meals, the carefully chosen words at public gatherings, the nervous glances when certain names were spoken. It was the absence of laughter in streets that once echoed with it, because the Holy Office wasn't just a building, it was an atmosphere. Let's talk about denunciations. These were the building blocks of inquisitorial power. Anyone, literally anyone, could accuse someone of heresy. And they did. You could report your neighbor for owning too many books, for skipping church, for sneezing during a sermon, for refusing to eat pork on a Wednesday. Yes, really. Suspicion became virtue. Gossip became gospel. The Edict of Grace sounds merciful, right? A 30-day period for voluntary confessions? Wrong. It was spiritual entrapment at its most devious. People scrambled to remember if they'd ever expressed a controversial opinion at a tavern or misquoted scripture during dinner. They confessed preemptively, hoping for leniency, only to implicate others by accident. One confession begot 10 more. Paranoia became a contagion. The church masterfully manipulated this fear. In towns like Toledo, Valencia, and Zaragoza, mass waves of accusations flooded in. Entire neighborhoods collapsed into a spiral of suspicion. In 1490 Seville, over 2,000 people were investigated in a single year. Whole families disappeared. Merchants fled. Scholars burned their libraries. One man was arrested because his wife dreamt that he might be Jewish. The Inquisition made the absurd feel rational. Informants were everywhere. Servants, barbers, blacksmiths, even beggars. Some were devout, others opportunistic. Many were desperate. Denouncing someone could curry favor with the church, eliminate a rival, or settle a grudge. A miller in Granada accused a competitor of heresy to inherit his land. A widow in Navarre informed on her daughter-in-law over a dowry dispute. The motivations were rarely holy, but the results were. Interrogations weren't always physical. Often, they were psychological warfare. Accused individuals were locked in isolation, starved, deprived of sleep, then questioned repeatedly under candlelight. The same questions, over and over, in different orders, with different priests, until reality unraveled, until doubt sounded like guilt. Sleep deprivation and hunger weren't just byproducts, they were tools. Confused minds confess faster. Refusing to accuse others? That was a red flag. Either you were too proud, too afraid, or part of the heretical conspiracy. There was no safe answer. Inquisitors favored the broken. Those who cracked, named names, and begged for mercy. Those were the cooperative ones. Truth became a commodity, negotiated under pressure. And let's not forget spiritual coercion. Priests would visit the accused in their cells, not to comfort them, but to remind them that resistance endangered their eternal soul. Confession wasn't just survival, it was salvation. The line between penitence and manipulation blurred into sacred blackmail. The public rituals reinforced the paranoia. The sight of chained prisoners led through the streets, wearing sanbenitos, yellow tunics marked with flames and demons, burned itself into communal memory. Every auto-da-fe reminded the crowd, this could be you. Parents warned their children not to ask questions. Lovers whispered in code. Even clergymen watched their backs. Some trials were open-air performances, complete with public reading of confessions, sermons about purity, and condemnation shouted from pulpits. Town squares became theaters of obedience. The auto-da-fe was as much about showmanship as it was about punishment. The condemned were often paraded like failed saints, shamed, shackled, and spectacle-bound. And yet, some fought back in silence. Manuscripts hidden behind walls. Coded messages in embroidery. Underground prayer circles. Secret libraries. Heresy became resistance. But it came with a cost. Entire lineages disappeared from history. Entire towns emptied of names. The record keepers erased what fire did not. There are documents, surviving in Vatican archives, of villagers accused of failing to smile during sermons. Others charged for hosting too many guests. One woman, in Andalusia, was interrogated for complimenting the wrong saint. That was enough. Enough to vanish. Imagine living in a world where your shadow had ears, where a neighbor's compliment could be a trap, where being too quiet was just as dangerous as speaking freely. Now open Twitter. Feel the echo? The Inquisition didn't invent social paranoia. It perfected it. They turned faith into surveillance, confession into currency, and your voice, a liability. Subscribe, like, comment, and share before your digital silence gets flagged as suspicious. After all, in the modern confessional booth, engagement is the only proof of innocence. Spain's greatest hit, auto-da-fe. If the Inquisition was a theater, then the auto-da-fe was its blockbuster premiere. Auto-da-fe Act of Faith sounds like a pious meditation. In reality, it was the most well-produced mass punishment parade in pre-modern Europe. Think of it as the Super Bowl of public shame, starring accused heretics, tortured souls, and smug inquisitors. Tickets weren't sold, but attendance was expected. Missing one? Now that could raise suspicions. Let's set the scene. A grand plaza in Seville or Madrid. Raised wooden platforms. Rows of clergy in black and red. Tapestries of Christ and crucifixes flanking the stage. Banners of the Inquisition fluttering in the wind. Trumpet sound. A procession emerges. The condemned are led in, some barefoot, others shackled. Most wearing the infamous sanbenito, a yellow tunic emblazoned with flames, devils, and the word heretic. Some tunics even bore illustrations of the punishment awaiting them, because medieval fashion loved a spoiler alert. The ceremony began with a solemn mass, because naturally, nothing says divine mercy like a prelude of incense and Latin liturgy before sentencing your neighbor to be roasted alive. The Inquisitor General, seated like a judge of souls, would rise and begin the public confessions. These weren't confessions of crimes as we understand them. They were declarations of spiritual deviation, coerced, rehearsed, and often read from a script written by someone else. If you confessed and showed proper remorse, you might be spared death. Perhaps you'd get lashes, a pilgrimage, property confiscation, or exile. If you denied everything, the stake awaited. Even if you died before the event, no problem. Your corpse could be tried, sentenced, and symbolically burned. The church loved consistency. Then came the sentencing parade. Each punishment was read aloud, and each name was a cautionary tale. You didn't just burn a person. You burned a message into the collective mind of the population. This wasn't merely punishment. It was a sacrament of terror. One of the largest autos-da-fe in history took place in Madrid in 1680, presided over by King Charles II. Over 120 accused heretics were displayed. A massive scaffold was erected in Plaza Mayor, complete with thrones for royalty, shaded viewing galleries for nobility, and vendor stalls for the peasants. There were printed programs. Eyewitnesses described it like a festival, if your festival featured screaming victims and smoking flesh. And the executions? Technically, the church never dirtied its hands with blood. That job was passed to the secular arm, a divine loophole, as if handing someone to the state for immediate immolation made the whole affair more palatable. "We don't kill," said the priests. "We purify." The burning took place outside city gates, in designated execution fields. Pyres were stacked high. Accused individuals were tied to posts. And as the flames rose, the crowd murmured prayers or cheered. Sometimes choirs sang. Children asked questions. Artists captured the scene. Human suffering became theology in motion. And don't think it ended there. The church kept detailed records of these events. The names, the crimes, the sentences. They published them, distributed them, made sure the legacy of fear spread beyond the plaza. In some towns, the smell of ash lingered for days. In others, they built statues. Memorials not for the dead, but for the triumph of doctrine. These events weren't just religious. They were political tools. Monarchs used them to demonstrate piety. The church used them to reinforce hierarchy. Communities used them to cleanse dissent. Watching someone burn became an act of national unity. The psychological damage was generational. Imagine growing up watching people be reduced to ash in the name of faith. Imagine walking past the San Benito garments hung in churches, each embroidered with name and fate. Constant reminders that salvation had a dress code and a death clause. Teachers, merchants, children, everyone learned one lesson. Obedience is survival. Auto da fe wasn't justice. It was choreography. Ritualized trauma disguised as spiritual instruction. Every gesture, every word, every scream was scripted to maintain control. It was morality weaponized into theater, salvation stage managed for submission, and the legacy? Still here. Modern cancel culture doesn't burn bodies, but it burns reputations. The scaffold is now a screen. The stake is now a common thread. The crowd still gathers. And the fear? Digital, viral, eternal. Smash that like, drop a comment, and subscribe before someone lights your algorithmic effigy. Because in the age of public trials and digital pyres, you're only one opinion away from your own auto-defeat. Sex, sin, and scapegoats. If the Inquisition had a guilty pleasure, it wasn't wine or gold. It was controlling sex. The Holy Tribunal had a curious obsession with the human body, especially when it came to what people did with it behind closed doors. Pleasure was suspect. Autonomy was dangerous. And women? Women were walking heresy factories. Tempting, unpredictable, and far too difficult to control. This chapter is a deep dive into the church's war on desire, wrapped in incense and guilt. And spoiler alert, it's not just about sin. It's about power. Let's begin with the witch hunts. Although not exclusive to the Inquisition, many were fueled by its ideology. Women who were healers, midwives, widows, or simply lived alone were prime targets. A knowledge of herbs? Sorcery. Too many cats? Demonic familiar. Enjoying sex? Possessed by the devil. The logic was beautifully circular. Deny the charges and you were lying, confess, and you prove them right. The infamous Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, was the Inquisition's unofficial manual of misogyny. Published in 1487 by two Dominican inquisitors, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, it framed female sexuality as an existential threat to Christian order. It described in grotesque detail how witches, i.e., independent women, used lust, dreams, and demonic pacts to destabilize the church. According to this text, women were more credulous, more deceptive, and more sexually insatiable than men. To be a woman was to be halfway to heresy. The torture chamber became a theater of perverse theology. Devices like the pear of anguish were inserted into orifices and expanded to tear flesh. Breast rippers were heated and used to shred the chests of women accused of seduction or blasphemy. The Spanish chair, covered in spikes and heated from below, was a particularly brutal way to ensure that the condemned's final thoughts were pure agony. These were not just punishments. They were performances of power over the body. And don't think men escaped. Sodomy, a term broadly applied to any non-procreative sex, was treated as spiritual treason. Accused men were castrated, executed, or forced to endure public penance. Priests caught in homosexual acts were defrocked, imprisoned, or worse. The line between sinner and scapegoat blurred when desire entered the picture. The Inquisition didn't merely punish acts. It criminalized thoughts. Impure fantasies, erotic dreams, or suggestive comments could all be reported, investigated, and punished. Confession booths became surveillance stations. One particularly tragic case tells a nun in 17th century Italy who confessed to having lustful dreams about angels. She was publicly flogged and confined to a cell for the rest of her life. Public humiliation was a form of moral theater. Adulterers marched through the streets barefoot, wearing ropes around their necks and signs around their torsos. Women who had abortions were stripped and whipped. Sex workers, if they weren't burned as witches, were paraded before crowds, heads shaved, bodies marked. Sex wasn't the sin. The sin was control. To take ownership of your body was to challenge the church's claim over your soul. Pleasure was rebranded as corruption. Desire as deviation. Love had to follow the catechism, or it was damned. Even within marriage, the Inquisition policed intimacy. Manuals instructed confessors to ask couples whether they had sex on holy days, in certain positions, or for enjoyment rather than procreation. Anything deemed excessive could be labeled as marital heresy. Yes, marital heresy. The church wasn't just moralizing. It was managing a theological economy of bodies. Control of sexuality meant control of inheritance, gender roles, social norms, and, most importantly, fear. Because a terrified body is an obedient body. And in the Inquisition's world, submission was salvation. Imagine living in a time where your fantasies could damn you, where a smile at the wrong person could cost you your life, and where entire genders were pre-condemned. Now consider purity culture, slut-shaming, reproductive restrictions, and the weaponization of sexuality in modern media. Sound familiar? Because heresy changes shape. But control? Control just updates its wardrobe. Subscribe, like, and comment below, unless the algorithm detects impure thoughts. In that case, brace yourself for the pixelated version of the pair of anguish. The digital tribunal never sleeps. The business of saving souls. If hell had a revenue model, the Inquisition perfected it. Behind the sanctimonious smoke of holy purpose, the Inquisition was also a financial machine. It didn't just torture bodies and burn heretics. It billed them for the pleasure. Heresy, it turned out, was quite profitable. Souls were saved, yes, but wallets were emptied first. Every accusation came with paperwork. Every trial, a fee. Every confession, cha-ching. The church had built not just a tribunal, but a spiritual economy where fear was a product, guilt was a currency, and the faithful were clients. It started with seizure of property. Once you were accused, even before any trial, your lands, house, furniture, livestock, and even clothes could be confiscated. Not held in escrow, but liquidated. Split between the Inquisition, the Crown, and private informants. Your children? Homeless. Your spouse? Impoverished. Entire families erased from the economic landscape for the crime of proximity to doubt. Inquisitors weren't volunteers. They were salaried officials, often rewarded financially for each successful conviction. Bonus structures varied by region, but the incentive was always there. More heretics, more assets, more glory. The Inquisition even published expense ledgers, detailing the cost of prison upkeep, interrogations, and executions, funded largely by the condemned themselves. Yes, you read that right. Prisoners paid for their own incarceration. Want water? That'll cost. Want to avoid starvation? Better hope your relatives can send coin. Some jails had menus. Want a blanket? Pay. Want a pillow? Pray harder and pay anyway. There were also bribes, pious ones naturally. A wealthy noble accused of heresy might offer a generous donation to the church in exchange for leniency. These arrangements weren't documented as corruption. They were considered spiritual gestures, redemption with receipts. And then came the indulgences. While not invented by the Inquisition, their sales soared in inquisitorial hotspots. You could prepay for forgiveness, hedge your bets in the afterlife, or secure posthumous pardons for dead relatives. Some indulgent sellers even had charts, prices based on severity of sin. Theft? 20 florins. Blasphemy? 50 murder? Let's talk bulk rates. Book confiscations were another lucrative stream. The Inquisition didn't just burn heretical texts, they cataloged them. Many were sold on black markets or quietly absorbed into private clerical libraries. In some cases, scribes made copies before flames. Heresy was dangerous, but profitable literature. The logistics were staggering. Cities like Seville, Barcelona, and Toledo had entire bureaucracies dedicated to managing inquisitorial funds. There were audit systems, ledgers, couriers, and storage vaults. Treasure chests, literally. Inquisitors often lived in opulence, velvet robes, gold crucifixes, silver-trimmed cells, while preaching humility and condemning vanity. Take Tomás de Torquemada, the Grand Inquisitor of Spain, a man whose name became synonymous with righteous cruelty. He presided over the confiscation of thousands of properties. His personal wealth grew so vast, he funded the construction of monasteries, libraries, and in delicious irony, Inquisition headquarters. His motto? The sinners must pay. And they did. The church defended these practices by claiming the funds supported pious causes, orphanages, hospitals, poor relief. And some of that was true, but much was redirected into furthering the reach of the Inquisition itself, expanding prisons, refining torture chambers, funding campaigns of terror across the Iberian Peninsula and beyond. Imagine being dragged from your bed, accused without evidence, and told your only hope of mercy lies in emptying your life savings. Imagine watching your home auction off, your name smeared, and your children punished for your imaginary sins. Now imagine all of it framed as divine mercy. The Inquisition wasn't just about religious purity. It was about resource extraction. It was a medieval racket, a theological Ponzi scheme, where every confession paid for the next accusation. Fear became a form of taxation. And the system worked beautifully because the people believed in it. They believed sin had a price. They believed redemption could be bought. And most importantly, they believed that if they paid enough, they might avoid the fire. Today, the grift is subtler. Institutions sell morality. Companies monetize guilt. And redemption comes in monthly subscriptions. You may not fear the stake, but your data still kneels at the altar. Subscribe, comment, and share, because we offer full absolution at no extra charge. For now. But if the algorithm starts charging penance per view, we'll be the first to sell indulgences in the comments. Blessed be the engagement. If you were there, a day in the dungeon. Let's not talk about the Inquisition today. Let's put you in it. You are in 15th century Castile. It's still dark. The smell of smoke and cold iron hangs in the air. You wake up to the sound of fists hammering wood. A priest, flanked by guards in tabards and chainmail, reads a decree by torchlight. You are accused of heresy. Why? A neighbor heard you question the sermon. Or maybe it was your uncle's books. Or the way you bowed. Too low, too late, or not at all. You try to speak. That's your first mistake. They don't need your version. You're dragged into the street. No time to dress. No time to think. You're blindfolded, thrown onto a cart, and hauled away past people who know your name but pretend not to. It's too dangerous to care. You arrive at the tribunal. A cold stone building with no sign, no symbol, just a gate that slams behind you with the weight of a verdict. You're led to your cell. It's not a room. It's a tomb with a lock. There's straw on the floor. Wet. You don't ask from what. A bucket for your needs. A crack in the wall for air. No light. Just time. Endless time. Long enough to forget whether it's day or night. Long enough to start doubting your own innocence. Then comes the first visit. A priest, kind voice, soft eyes. He speaks of redemption. He urges confession. He says it's easier if you volunteer. Easier for your soul. Easier for your body. He leaves a Bible. In Latin. You can't read Latin. You wait. Then come the guards. They say it's time. The interrogation room is colder than your cell, lit by oil lamps that spit and hiss. There's a table, a chair, and a wall lined with instruments, hooks, blades, chains, things you can't name. A scribe dips his quill and waits. You're asked, do you deny the charges? Have you consorted with heretics? Do you reject the sacraments? Do you own forbidden texts? You say no. You say you're innocent. That's mistake number 2. They show you the strappado. You're hoisted by your arms tied behind your back. Then dropped. Your shoulders don't dislocate. They scream. Pain floods your body. You pass out. When you wake, the questions resume. You say you don't know. That's mistake number 3. The rack is next. You are stretched slowly, deliberately. Your knees separate. Your hips scream. Your spine fights to stay whole. You feel things tearing. You begin to speak. Names, places, phrases you barely remember. It doesn't matter. It's not about truth. It's about momentum. Next comes the water torture. You are tied to a board, cloth stuffed in your mouth, water poured in slowly, steadily. You gag. You thrash. You feel your lungs drown while your body stays dry. They call it cleansing. You call it death. You're returned to your cell. A man next to you sobs through the wall. You smell burned flesh. You hear the chants of monks. Days pass, or hours. You can't tell. You try to pray, but the words don't come. Eventually, you are summoned again. This time, they dress you. A yellow tunic, the San Benito, your name stitched across the chest, your fate across the back. Relapse heretic. You're paraded through the streets. The crowd murmurs. Some look away. Others stare. Children throw stones. You see a friend. They look through you. Your identity is already gone. In the plaza, a platform waits. Next to it, a pyre. They read your sentence. Public penance. Whipping. Forced pilgrimage. Property seized. You're lucky, they say. Someone else, a woman accused of consorting with demons, is burned beside you. Her screams echo into the sky. That night, you are released. Broken. Penniless. Marked. You return to a home that's been looted. Your neighbors won't speak to you. Your name is cursed. You cannot marry. You cannot work. You are watched. Forever. Even your dreams are not your own anymore. In sleep, you return to the cell. You smell the oil. You hear the chains. You feel the questions clawing at your ribs. You never speak of it. You can't. The walls have ears. The priests remember. And the next whisper might be yours. All of it, every moment, every scar, is written in ink in a ledger in some dark office where a man smiles at how many souls he has purified this week. He files your name. He forgets your face. But you remember, and it lives in your bones. Like, comment, and subscribe, because history doesn't repeat itself. It just upgrades its torture devices. Don't let your story be rewritten by silence. Speak before someone else scripts your suffering. From Torquemada to Twitter, has anything changed? The fires are out. The scaffolds dismantled. The dungeons emptied. The Holy Office is now a museum. And yet, doesn't it all feel familiar? Let's review. The Inquisition police thought punished dissent and weaponized shame. It turned confession into a ritual of control, turned crowds into judges, and used spectacle to solidify power. And those centuries have passed. The tools haven't vanished. They've just gone digital, repackaged to the screen instead of the stake. Today, we don't wear San Benitos. We wear social media profiles. Our sins aren't read from pulpits. They're pulled from tweets, screenshots, and old videos. The tribunal isn't in a cathedral. It's in your notifications. The accusation isn't carved in stone. It's pinned, retweeted, and tagged. The auto-da-fe of today is a cancellation thread, the viral takedown, the call-out carousel. It may not burn flesh, but it scorches reputations, evaporates careers, and leaves psychic wounds that fester quietly behind curated posts. The Inquisitors wore robes. Now they wear avatars, anonymous handles, faceless mobs armed with hashtags and certainty. They chant slogans instead of hymns. Their dogma likes shares in righteous outrage. The crowd still gathers. The shame still spreads. The spectacle still monetizes. And like the autos-da-fe of old, it's not always about guilt. It's about performance. Public purification. A digital theater of collective catharsis. One wrong word and the masses chant, repent, retract, disappear. Even the old tools have modern twins. The confessional is now a leaked DM or a forced apology video. The ledger is your post history. The torture chamber is a comment thread that never ends. We don't stretch people on racks. We stretch their mental health over months of performative penance. And don't forget the economy. Outrage is profitable. Platforms thrive on polarity. The algorithm amplifies conflict. The more divisive the content, the more attention it grabs. Attention is data. Data is money, and so the fires are kept burning, not by zealots in cloaks, but by CEOs in hoodies. Think about it. The church once sold indulgences to cleanse souls. Now influencers sell redemption arcs. Brands issue statements. Celebrities apologize with stage lighting. Even morality is PR now. And just like the Inquisition, modern public shame is selective. Powerful figures often escape with minimal damage. But the ordinary, the low profile, the unprotected, the already marginalized, they burn fast and bright. The pyre may be metaphorical, but the ruin is real. It's tempting to say, this is different. After all, we have rights. We have laws. We have democracy. But ask yourself, does fear still dictate silence? Are people still afraid to speak, to question, to dissent? Do we still police each other for the sake of belonging? Because if so, we haven't evolved. We've just changed costumes. Torquemada's power came from his audience. The same is true today. Platforms, mobs, politicians, trolls, they only thrive if we play along. It's easy to condemn the past. Harder to recognize its fingerprints on our present. So has anything really changed? Yes and no. We're not burning bodies, but we're still lighting fires. We're not silencing with shackles, but we're muting with mobs. We're not demanding confession under torture, but we're expecting apologies at gunpoint, metaphorically. It's easy to see Torquemada as a monster, but harder to ask, what would we do with his tools today? Because if history teaches us anything, it's this: power loves purity, crowds love punishment, and fear, once installed, doesn't retire. So subscribe, comment, and share before someone mistakes your silence for guilt. Because history may be written by the victors, but it's enforced by the audience. Stay loud, stay skeptical, and above all, stay human.